Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to continue right along with our discussion on African Americans after 1970. So in our last lecture we were looking at the rise of black political office holders. Um, Noting the arrival of the first African American females in the national legislature in the United States Congress, the sharp rise in the awareness and the expert use of the demographic, of the increased demographic in the former free states, particularly in urban centers, major urban centers in the along the northeastern seaboard, along the Great Lakes, cities such as Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Gary, Indiana, and then also cities along the West Coast, such as later on Oakland and Los Angeles. They were able to use their demographics outright to achieve political a political reputation never before seen in the history of the Republic, and in locations such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They were able to use the population that relocated to those areas during the Great Migration has a starting base, but also the political leaders who became mayors of cities and became mayors of those cities were able to form powerful coalitions with other groups within the city to gain access to office. And it is from there, on the heels of that, that we sort of dive into the next phase of this office holding, the political awakening of the African American community. And that would be in 1972 with the National Black Political Convention. That was the name, that was actually the name of the convention. And it about a year after the founding of the Congressional Black Caucus, the CBC, African American politicians got together and held the National Black Political Convention, and they issued the Black Declaration of Independence, which called on the Democratic Party, which by 1972, after the election of Richard Nixon, a change had occurred in which very clearly the Democratic Party was the out and open social conservative party, and the Republican Party, which you can't really label, had the Liberal Party, but the party most likely to support civil rights, owing to the legacy of the radical Republicans and presidents like Abraham Lincoln and Chester A. Arthur. The presidents who, while not entirely devoid of the racial sentiments of their age, were more or less inclined to treat the issue of racial discrimination and Jim Crow with a lot more sensitivity than their Democratic counterparts during the late 19th century, early 20th century would. You can think of a president like Woodrow Wilson being in that mold of someone who was socially conservative vis-a-vis race relations, and openly espoused racist beliefs and promoted racist policies. And you can contrast that with the president that immediately preceded him, William Howard Taft. Taft wasn't someone that I would say was devoid of the sentiments of his age, but Taft did believe in the rule of law, and it was under his presidency that the first African American political leader and social leader was invited to stay overnight at the White House, and that of course would be Booker T. Washington, the renowned community leader from Alabama. He was of course noted for the founding and the management of the Tuskegee Institute, which later became Tuskegee University. But moving along from that, they called on the Democratic Party, which at this point had become the liberal party in the United States, to come together and to work to further racial equality in the Republic. In 1977, the CBC formed Trans Africa, an organization to lobby on behalf of African nations. Now, Trans Africa will play an important role in securing sanctions against the apartheid segregation regime in South Africa. Now, although divided over many issues, the CBC is one of the most influential caucuses within Congress today, and it's generally known and acknowledged at the conscience of Congress. Now, in past lectures, we touched on Jesse Jackson. We did a brief synopsis of his political career when we looked at African American politicians who rose after 1970, who rose in prominence after 1970. Now, to begin with, let me just say that while African American mayors made their mark on municipal politics and congresspersons gave voice to the needs of African American constituencies in the national legislature, during the latter half of the 20th century, and really coincided with the fourth wave, the wave that began after 1970. During this time, there was one African American who really stood out head and shoulders above his peers, and that was Jesse Jackson. And his career is really nothing really short of remarkable. It's really nothing short of just this remarkable, wonderful story of rising from humble origins to sort of striding the landscape of African American social, political, economic, and intellectual thought. So Jesse Jackson, during the course of his career, rose awareness of African American needs on the national level, a remarkable feat in and of itself, considering that he never won major elected office. He was elected as the shadow senator for the District of Columbia, but aside from that, he never held a mayoralship. He was never a congressman. He was never a senator, never a member of a political cabinet, and never president or vice president himself, never a state governor or a state legislator. So it's a remarkable achievement in and of itself for him to have those accomplishments under his belt. Jackson was born in South Carolina to a teenage mother. He attended and graduated from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State College, the HBCU, one of the premier HBCUs, and the HBCU of note in North Carolina. From there, he went on to become an ordained minister from the Chicago Theological Seminary. Now, Jackson's public career began in earnest in 1965 when he took part in the Selma March, which proved to be a life-changing event for Jackson, as he would later note himself. After the Selma March, Jackson became involved directly in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, working closely with the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Jackson was one of King's aides, and he was present. Unfortunately, he was present at the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Jackson's experiences led him to found Operation Push, People United to Serve Humanity, which sought to empower African Americans economically. That was literally picking up the mantle or picking up the baton and carrying it across the threshold. Towards the end of his life, that was Martin Luther King Jr.'s aim. He wanted to improve the economic situation of the African American community. And Push was Jackson's effort to do just that. Now, Jesse Jackson is best known and best remembered for his presidential bids in the 1980s. Beginning in 1983, Jackson announced his candidacy for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Jackson pledged to build a rainbow coalition comprised of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds in the Republic. Jackson's platform was progressive, to say the least. It was one of the most progressive political platforms that any politician or aspiring politician ever came up with, or introduced to the public in general. Now, at the time, Jackson was both critical of both of the major parties, the Democratic and the Republican parties, for failing to tackle the problems of racism, poverty, and corporate economic dominance. These are themes that he's bringing up in 1983 for his presidential bid. Now, Jackson won the support of many, and that surprised observers. No one really thought that he had a chance. And again, that's because he was not a politician. He had most been known as a civic grassroots organizer, not as a seasoned or even a junior politician. Now, Jackson faced many major obstacles during his candidacy. Namely, he had to overcome this major hurdle after he was after anti-Semitic remarks he made regarding New York City came to light. Jackson failed to win the nomination in 1984, but he electrified delegates at the 1984 Democratic National Convention, where he cemented his reputation as a wordsmith and a gifted orator, what is called to keep hope alive. It's become a hallmark phrase in the African American community, and really sort of helped to buoy him after his failure of winning the party's nomination. Now, in 1986, Jackson, still hoping to gain the Democratic Party's nomination for presidency, founded or formed really the Rainbow Coalition, which, as I stated earlier, served as both a national vehicle for his future politics and political aspirations, and also was formed to promote his progressive social politics. The issues that he wanted to see addressed, he formed this sort of grassroots organization to further those. In 1988, this new support base served Jackson well. Had the Rainbow Coalition attracted minority, impoverished voters and a large number of delegates at the Democratic National Convention in 1988. Now, despite his successes at motivating this base, Jackson lost the nomination. He lost the nomination in '84 to Walter Mondale, and in 1988 he lost the nomination to then Governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis. Now, since 1988, Jackson has continued his efforts to raise support for progressive politics and initiatives, including inspiring parents to take a more proactive stance towards education. He's been a major force in influencing corporations to become more diverse in their hiring practices, and he's been an outspoken supporter for allowing the District of Columbia to achieve statehood. Jackson also led unofficial diplomatic missions on behalf of the government to release Americans held abroad during conflicts. He's also been used to try to help settle international conflicts. And just before we move on, just to give like a sort of brief synopsis of the overall arcing career of Jesse Jackson, in 1966, he first becomes an aide to Dr. King, and he organized the Chicago Freedom Movement to fight for integrated schools and open housing for African American families. A year later, in 1967, Jackson is appointed as the director of Operation Breadbasket by the SCLC. Now, Operation Breadbasket's mission is to help increase African American employment levels, promote African American produced goods, and promote better housing opportunities in urban centers for African American families. In 1968, Jackson is ordained as a Baptist minister. Later, in April of 1968, Jackson travels to Memphis to support Dr. King as he's aiding striking sanitation workers. And it is at that event that Dr. King is assassinated, and Jesse Jackson witnesses the assassination. Now, in 1971, Jackson organizes the Black Expo in Chicago to promote awareness of black-owned businesses. Now, disputes within the SCLC between Jackson and the leaders of that organization leads to Jackson's removal as the director of Operation Breadbasket. After his split with the SCLC, Jackson then goes on to found Operation Push, which serves as a broader base. It gives him an opportunity to appeal to a broader base to make his mission and his organization a more cosmopolitan organization, and to give him a wider base than he had with the SCLC. Now, 8 years later, in 1979, Jackson meets with Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, and with Hafez al-Assad, the then sitting president of Syria. Now, this move is controversial in the United States and is interpreted by many as anti-Semitic, particularly by the pro-Israel lobby in the United States, who are angered that Jackson would involve himself in peace talks. And there's a number of reasons why they were angry. One, Jackson wasn't a politician. Jackson didn't have a reputation or really the sort of standing in the United States to be considered a foreign diplomacy expert. And then on top of that, the thought that, Jackson, who had been linked with what many considered an aspect of the counterculture, the civil rights movement, would go off and involve himself in these matters, also drew the ire of many people. Now, in 1981, Jackson meets with Coca-Cola executives, and he arranges for the corporation to increase African American representation in their management. Jackson reaches similar agreements with Kentucky Fried Chicken, Anheuser-Busch, 7-Up, and the Southland Corporation, as well as with Burger King. He meets with these executives, and he gets them to open up employment opportunities. One can think of this as also furthering his or Dr. King's mission to increase economic opportunity for the community. Now, 2 years later, in 1983, that's the year that he announces his presidency, his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for the presidency, and he secures the release of Lieutenant Robert Goodman, who had been taken hostage in Syria. Now, in 1984, Jackson becomes the first African American to run for the Democratic Party nomination. He's not the first African American to be nominated for office. Back in the 1870s, 1880s, women's groups had made several bids to gain political office, and one such group had nominated Frederick Douglass as a vice presidential candidate. Douglass was a lifelong Republican, and then again, that's because at that point they were mainly associated with the pro-civil rights policies. After all, Douglass had been very good friends with the radical Republicans. He had been very in with the radical Republicans. And of course, back then the Democratic Party was the party of what had been the pro-slavery party, and was at this point the anti-civil rights party. All before the political realignments of the 1960s had impacted by the counterculture revolution. So Jackson becomes the first African American to purposely run for office. He runs for the Democratic Party nomination for president. Now, Jackson's campaign draws in 3.5 million votes and leads to the registration of more than 1 million new voters. Also in 1984, Jackson leads the 25th anniversary march on Washington. 2 years later, in 1986, he takes a leading role in the social campaign to persuade American businesses to divest themselves from holdings in South Africa. And again, this is an effort to break the power of the apartheid Jim Crow segregationist regime in South Africa. In 1988, Jackson loses his bid for the Democratic Party nomination. He loses that to Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. He comes in as first runner-up with more than 7 million votes, doubling his number from 1984, and leading to the registration count of 2 million new voters. Remarkable achievements. Not all of Jesse Jackson's achievements, but we'll break here, and we'll come back and we'll continue on with our discussion of Jesse Jackson's career, and we'll move on to further examine the challenges that awaited the African American community during the 1990s. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.